race is on, and while Charles Leclerc made it 2 wins out of 3 for Ferrari with victory in the Australian Grand Prix, Max Verstappen made it 2 retirements out of 3 after dropping out of 2nd place. So does this mean we now have a clear title favourite? And why was Leclerc so dominant in a race where he was expected to be given a run for his money? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to answer those questions and many more are Scott Mitchell and Mark Hughes. Well, Mark, great to be back in Australia. I say that as if I'm there. This is one of the few races I'm not at, so I'm doing this from the UK, but you two are out there. It was good from my end to see Australia back, given the couple of years away. So what was it like to be there?
It was wonderful. It did feel like returning to finish off, how it all ended so badly 2 years ago. And it felt like a big celebratory party because it was beautiful weather. Fantastic crowd, and just a beautiful sort of it wasn't like the Australian summer, but it was a very warm, sunshiny day, and you could smell the grass in the air, and it's just a real party atmosphere. It was it was lovely.
And Scott, you love a party atmosphere, so you must have had a great weekend.
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing, and I just think F1 loved being back in Melbourne, and Melbourne absolutely loved having F1 back. I'm sure that, like there are with any city race, probably some dissenters around the place. But I think ultimately the numbers speak for themselves, and the official figure was, I think, around 420,000 attendees over the whole weekend, which I think makes this the biggest weekend sporting event in Australian history. There's obviously a couple of caveats there, but you could apply a few more caveats and those numbers would still be absolutely astonishing. So full credit to everyone who made the effort to go to this Grand Prix. You could feel that sort of pent up demand. This is obviously a place that has had among the strictest, if not the strictest, COVID restrictions during the pandemic, and Melbourne is a city that loves to put events on. So it did, like Mark said, it had a party atmosphere. It just felt like a celebration, and yeah, we didn't get the Grand Prix quite on the level of Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, but as we were walking out of the track today, I suggested to Mark that actually it was, for an Australian Grand Prix, it was actually very, very good, because of all of the things that is mega about Melbourne, this has never been the most exciting race.
Yeah, and there's no lack of things to talk about, as we're going to get onto in this podcast. So although it maybe wasn't one of those wheel-to-wheel thrillers, it was still a fascinating weekend. So let's dive straight into it. And Mark, go with the traditional opening question. How did Leclerc take what was the most dominant victory of the season so far?
By sheer pummeling pace. It was one of those old-fashioned ones that wasn't about a strategy battle or anything like that. He just set pole, won the start, blasted off into the distance, won the restart, pulled out a big gap, nearly lost a second restart, but recovered and pulled out a big gap all over again, and then just controlled. It could have been, a much bigger winning margin. He was just, everything was totally in control. The Ferrari was in a very sweet spot, and the Red Bull wasn't. And I think the picture, the Red Bull being out of its balance sweet spot, it flattered some other cars. But when you looked at, say, the performance gap between Ferrari and Mercedes, it was just as it's been for the previous 2 races. Similarly, McLaren looked, when they're starting 4th on the grid, you'd say, oh, well, they've made some sort of breakthrough, but they really hadn't. It was just the circuit suited them quite well, but their performance deficit to the front was much as it's been so far.
Yeah, it's to be expected, really, because this is a very, very different circuit to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. But perhaps you could elaborate a bit, Mark, on those Red Bull problems. It's not unusual for them to have slight balance problems and not be in the sweet spot in qualifying this year. But we did go into the race relatively confident they'd go pretty well. They looked good on Friday on the long runs. Yeah,
they got a bit thrown by the evolution of the circuit. It rubbers in a lot. And the concern on Friday was rear graining. And they were anticipating that to become an increasing problem through the weekend. And they based their Saturday running around alterations to control rear graining. And it was only Subsequently, they realised they'd gone completely the wrong direction, and front graining was now the problem. But in the era of parc fermé, of course, that's where they ended up, and so it was a particularly awkward car to drive in. Well, you've seen turn 13, you saw Max spin there, and Saturday morning you saw Sergio go across the grass there in the race. Just that tight final sector, those tight turns with a lot of steering lock, it was just an awkward, not particularly nice car through there, the way that they'd set it up to look after what they thought was going to be a rear tyre problem. It turned out to be a front tyre problem.
And of course, Verstappen did later retire from second place. We'll get on to the reasons for that in a moment. Sergio Perez came through to second ahead of George Russell. But Scott, Leclerc's now well clear in the drivers' standings, isn't he? 46 points ahead of Verstappen. Actually, George Russell's in second place, 34 points down. It's early days, but do we now officially have a new title favourite?
Yes, we do. I've got absolutely no issue declaring it, because Leclerc's driving at a really, really high level. He's got a massive points lead, and I think he's got the fastest car. He's got the fastest and most reliable car. It looks, I might be cursing them into a run of absolute misery now, but that thing looks bulletproof. The Ferrari, it works on every type of circuit. It's quick in qualifying. It's quick in the race. It seems to manage its tyres well. It's reliable. I haven't seen any problems really with it on that side, and Leclerc's just getting the job done. He's always there, even if he's had a slightly difficult session or might be under pressure in certain ways. It's always there when it counts in qualifying, and in the races, we had the first inkling of a mistake from him. The bit where he just ran out of grip coming through the final corner on the second safety car restart, obviously allowed Verstappen to properly attack into turn one, and I thought Verstappen was going to have the place, but Leclerc did do a very good job of seeing him off. I feel like that's the first mistake we've seen from Leclerc in a meaningful session, and by that I mean Q3 or the Grand Prix, and he still recovered from it very well. So ultimately, I think the Mercedes drivers are closer to Leclerc than Verstappen is, and they obviously have nowhere near as fast a car. So at the moment, there is a long way to go, and there is absolutely opportunity for that to eradicate and be overturned, and Leclerc and Ferrari could finish nowhere near the front of the championship by the end of 23 races. But right now, who else do you pick? Verstappen's massively on the back foot compared to Leclerc.
Yeah, and that point you make about the car working everywhere, it's a car for all seasons, isn't it? And you have to say as well, operationally, Ferrari are seeming to be pretty sharp. That's helped by the car being seemingly quite controllable, but they didn't get caught out by the track surface and that kind of thing. And of course, it was a resurfaced track. They didn't have time and the chance to water blast it, so it was evolving very rapidly, as Mark said. But Mark, on the topic of the Ferrari pace, as ever, we've got questions from members of the Race Members Club. And Guy from the US says, is Ferrari's porpoising really harming them on race pace? Isn't it brutal physically on the driver as well? Obviously, that's referencing the fact that car was porpoising a hell of a lot on that blast to turn 9, wasn't it? It looked like a very rough ride.
Yeah, it looks horrible when you see the driver's head bouncing along like that. Leclerc insists it's nowhere near as bad as it looks, and he's not really that bothered by it. But, in terms of the effect it has on the car's competitiveness, it's happening at a speed well beyond the fastest corner speed. So it's not really hurting that much. It'll be hurting a bit. It's not ideal for the tyres to be bounced around like that, and it will be costing a little bit of straight line speed, but nothing really meaningful. The problem is if you are getting it in a speed range where the corners are, and that's where Mercedes was in certain corners, and that's when you have to raise the car up to get rid of the porpoising. But you can live with it if it's only doing it on the straights, and you still get the downforce, which is inducing it. You still get the benefits of that. So yeah, that's just where that car's at.
Imagine how quick that car's going to be when they get on top of the porpoising.
Yeah, I mean it's not necessarily a given that they will, because it's like I say, it's two facets of the the same characteristic. It's downforce with these cars does tend to induce porpoising, and it's just a question of whether that's happening at a competitive enough speed to allow you to run it like that.
I've got a theory that anatomically Charles Leclerc's got some clever shock absorber in it, because he said this sort of thing before, not just about the porpoising this year. I remember asking him in Austin last year when all the drivers were complaining about bumps. I remember asking him about it. He said, I don't really notice. It just seems to go straight through him without affecting him, which is probably helping him.
He's just a real racer, isn't he? He's just, proper grit, old school driver, doesn't care about any of this. He's just a hardcore physical racer.
Yeah, absolutely. He's quite happy to live with anything as long as the car doesn't break, and it works, and it's worked very, very well for him so far. So all credit to him, all credit to Ferrari. They're in a very, very good place, and we have to say the fact that they seem to understand the car and it's working well is encouraging, because it means that theoretically their development progress with new parts, etc. They did experiment with a slight diffuser tweak on Leclerc's car on Friday, which they didn't carry through, but they'll be hoping that worked as hoped and the development direction does yield the performance they expect. Let's talk a little bit about Red Bull's problems, though, Scott. Verstappen was 7.4 seconds behind Leclerc when he stopped early on lap 39. The race was over by that point anyway. It's his second retirement in 3 races, so what went wrong?
Well, it looks like there was a fuel leak. Red Bull are being a little bit coy in terms of what they're saying in explicit terms, but Christian Horner said it was a problem. It was a problem in the fuel system outside of the tank. It was obvious on the data. Max could smell it in the car. So some fuel has leaked somewhere. And there was a suggestion that there was a split pipe. Somewhere in the system. So I don't know exactly what, obviously, like knock-on effect that may or may not have caused. Exactly. But clearly they had a problem with the fuel system. Or within the fuel system. It's not the same as the issue that they had in Bahrain. That's worth clarifying. But it's a serious concern for Red Bull, because I think they were topping the car up with hydraulic fluid before the Grand Prix started. Verstappen said he went into the race knowing it was a risk that he wouldn't finish, but that was with a different problem to what actually caused his Grand Prix to end. Christian Horner said that the other issue wouldn't have ended his race. So the suggestion is that whatever they were worried about wouldn't have come to pass before the end of the Grand Prix. But that's two issues in one day, both of which were clearly potentially race ending. One of them did end his race. AlphaTauri have gone through various power unit problems over the first couple of Grand Prix weekends. They had that silly double DNF in Bahrain. It's really not encouraging at the moment for Red Bull powertrains. It's obviously the Honda engine, and there would have been a lot of work that went into re-optimizing the engine for the E10 fuel this year. But otherwise, it's the power unit that ran super reliably last year. It's still being built, assembled, maintained, whatever, by Honda in Sakura, and then just shipped and managed by ex-Honda employees that are now Red Bull Powertrains employees. So something's changed since last year to suddenly give Red Bull a big reliability headache. And the way Verstappen was talking after the race, it doesn't sound like he has a huge amount of confidence that that's going to be absolutely 100% fixed by Imola. Christian Horner admitted that they have issues that they need to get on top of quickly. So there's a possibility here that Red Bull doesn't have the fastest car and also has an unreliable one. And it's put Verstappen on the back foot massively. And he could go to Imola and immediately eat into that deficit to Verstappen. To Leclerc. But at the same time could go to Imola and, I don't know, not finish or have a problem in qualifying. It doesn't really sound like a particularly reassuring situation.
Yeah, and there's a lot that they're not happy with there. Verstappen, after qualifying, said that they struggle with getting the setup right for for the car in qualifying trim that every race he goes into the sim to try and work on a baseline and it's not quite there. So there's a lot to work through there. Mark, do you think this is a particularly worrying situation for Red Bull, or is it just early season teething troubles?
I suspect the latter, and I suspect it's a run-on from the championship battle of last year, which Ferrari didn't need to concern itself about. And I think we're just seeing a better developed car from Ferrari, a car that was developed earlier and which they were able to learn about more thoroughly and do many more iterations of reliability, but also performance. And I think that's really what it is. It's clear the Red Bull can be as fast as the Ferrari, maybe even faster sometimes. But for what we're seeing so far is that the Ferrari doesn't miss a beat and is always quick, is always competitive. The Red Bull is sometimes very quick and sometimes struggles a little bit.
If you asked Mercedes or Red Bull last year about the knock-on effect of the championship fight, they're like, no, it's all fine. We're sticking to our plan. Then, of course, this year, as soon as Red Bull's struggling well, of course, we had that disadvantage. It's funny how something that isn't going to be a problem and is emphatically dismissed one year becomes an excuse this year. But there is still plenty of time to go. Although we should say only 6 drivers have overcome a points deficit of the same size that Verstappen's got to win a championship. And that's adjusting for all the different point systems over the year. So even though he's got loads of time to go, it's not a great position to be in. It's always difficult to play catch-up, no matter how many races you've got. Well, staying on Red Bull, Mark, we shouldn't overlook the fact Perez finished second. He's actually just ahead of Verstappen in the championship now. So why does he seem slightly less perplexed by the car, particularly in qualifying trim, than Verstappen? I know he wasn't delighted with everything and the strategy with the tyre prep and that kind of thing wasn't quite to his liking, but he seems a little bit more comfortable with the car over a single lap than Verstappen.
Yeah, he is. This car tends to have a bit of an understeer balance. And last year's was tending towards an oversteer balance. And I think this is just allowing Sergio to drive the way he prefers. And it puts an artificial ceiling on Verstappen, if you like. You're still getting everything there is out of the car. And he's still generally a bit quicker than Sergio, but not by as much as when the car was a little bit more demanding.
Yeah, that's often a pattern that we see with a mega driver will get more out of a trickier car sometimes, but Perez doing exactly the job that he's there for. Scott, let's talk about Carlos Sainz. We'll probably spend more time talking about him than he actually spent racing, given how short his race lasted. He ended up in the gravel at turn 10 on lap 2. After both qualifying in the race, he was using words like horrible and disaster, which seemed pretty appropriate. So to what extent were his woes beyond his control, and to what extent were they down to him?
When I talked to him after the race, it sounds like the position he found himself in to have to play catch up that led him to become impatient was not of his own making. Obviously, he was very, very quick this weekend. He was absolutely in contention for pole. I actually wondered if he might have had just half a tenth on Leclerc when it mattered. But he didn't get a chance to really show that when it mattered because he had a problem. They had a problem firing up the car in Q3, so he wasn't able to get the extra run in, basically.
The extra lap for prep.
Yeah, sorry, the extra lap. So, and what a lot of people have found is that it's the second push lap where the lap time's coming on the tyres.
And, of course, that was after the first run in Q3. The red flag came out about half a second before he crossed the line.
Yeah, where it looked like he was on course to set a really quick lap time. So on that final run in Q3, it just wasn't there for him. He didn't have the grip, the confidence to push as he needed to, and it was just a bit messy. So he was down in 9th on the grid, which was way lower than it should have been, and that all stemmed from this problem firing the car up. And then on Sunday, just before the race, Ferrari had to change his steering wheel because there was some switch problems, which I think he said had been the case the day before as well. And then with that new wheel, he had a problem with the launches on the formation lap and then the Grand Prix start itself, where it seemed to have the wrong torque mapping. So he was in he had the wrong torque setting on, basically. So had an absolutely awful start, dropped a few places, and from then on, it's all Carlos. Carlos becomes, from that moment on, the architect of his downfall. He's just fallen from a lower height, I think, because of the car issues. He immediately looked impatient, and that's the word he used afterwards. So I think he's frustrated with himself, because there was one move he tried. He was on a hiding to nothing, trying to go around the outside of someone on the opening lap at what is now turn 11, the right-hander at the end of the long back straight after the S's. That corner is now a much tighter, slower corner, and there's barely any room on the exit. And unsurprisingly, Carlos was given no room on the exit, so he lost a few places. And then while being frustrated, he then lost control of the car. I think next time by, wasn't it, on the second lap, going into the S's, and then spun across the track. Did quite well to find a gap in between, I think, a Haas and an Alfa Romeo, and avoid absolutely skittling someone else. But then the car came to rest in the gravel on the outside of the second part of the S's. He was beached. He sort of forlornly asked if the marshals might be able to push him back going again, but that was obviously just a bit out of desperation, and it just sort of summed up where he was at. But at that point, I think he was just absolutely gutted, really annoyed with himself, because I think he's a better and smarter driver than that. I think he just let the situation get a hold of him in a way that it shouldn't have.
Yeah, you can tell the mindset. He was determined to make up places early on, had that moment with Tsunoda, who hung him out to dry quite legitimately at turn 11. And then, when he was passing Schumacher, wasn't he went off. He also made a little bit of an error after he went off, because all incidents aren't the same, but when Magnussen went off there later in the race, he managed to get the car straightened up before he was onto the grass, so he was able to live to tell the tale, whereas Sainz couldn't get onto it early enough to do that. That's very much the last order problem he had. The mistake had happened before that, but just, a series of errors for Sainz. I do wonder if the fact that he also knows that he needs to try and stay in touch with Leclerc to avoid becoming the number two. And in fact, Mark, we got a question from Yannis van der Waal about that, who says, has Sainz now ended up in the situation of becoming number two driver? The hectic start looks like a desperate move in that spirit. Do you agree?
It's difficult to get back from where he is now. Just in terms of the points deficit and the focus of the challenge for the championship. If it was just, whether he was going to finish third and fourth, it wouldn't really matter so much. But I think the team will absolutely be ready to prioritise Leclerc in what I would think they will be expecting to be a championship fight with Verstappen. So, he's put himself in a very, very tough situation, Carlos. And difficult to see, even if his performance subsequently matches those of Charles. He's not. It's difficult to see how he's going to reclaim that points deficit that he's at after just 3 races.
And the thing that will be really, really stinging for him now, in that context, is, had things just gone a little differently for him in Q3, this could have been the weekend where he proved he's capable of being as quick, if not quicker, than Leclerc in this car. Could have qualified pole, won from pole, or at least been in that fight. And then he comes away from here not only closer in terms of points, but having sent a message. And I think that it's a different kind of frustration and feeling, I think, for Sainz coming away from this weekend than, say, Bahrain, where we were having a different version of the same conversation, weren't we? He was second best. He looked like someone that could quite quickly slot into a number 2 role, but he knew that he had a lot more to come. He knew that he just underperformed that weekend, hadn't got the most out of it. Here he was quick. Here he could have done what he needed to do to not be considered the number 2. And it's gone the worst possible way. And as Mark said, probably cemented that position, or if not quite fully cemented, it definitely set him well on the way to that. So I think that will make it sting even more.
Yeah, it doesn't mean he'll be given a slow car or anything. It just means that the team naturally galvanises behind the de facto leader, and performance ultimately decides that. But he'll know that, and he'll certainly won't have been giving up hope. But this is pretty much the nadir of his Ferrari career so far.
It's also worth pointing out that Ferrari won't need much cause to go into a de facto number one, number two situation, because Red Bull has it emphatically. I know we've talked about Perez doing better this season, but he is there to be Verstappen's wingman first and foremost. And if Red Bull get on top of that car, make it a bit quicker and a lot more reliable, Verstappen will start racking up the points quite quickly, and he will do that knowing that he's not going to have that internal threat. Perez isn't going to take points off Verstappen if they're in a position where they can move Perez aside and give Verstappen those points. Ferrari knows that it makes it. What's happened to Sainz now makes it a lot easier for Ferrari to handle that, because if they were neck and neck and they were still trying to go down the equal opportunity route, then I think it'd be a bit more tricky. Again, just to reiterate the point that you made, Ed, that doesn't mean Ferrari's going to start stitching Sainz up and find ways to stop him winning. It just means if there's a situation where let's say they're 1 and 2 and Verstappen's third or something like that, and there's a decent enough gap, Sainz, in crucial situations, they are going to have to make decisions every now and again that mean we have to favour the driver that's likely to win the championship. And in those marginal moments, it'll be Leclerc that gets picked.
Yeah, it's only logical. You have to play the cards you're dealt sensibly. I actually think it could be quite a big strength for Ferrari, because I can see Sainz taking plenty of points off Verstappen through the season, so that's what they'll be hoping for from him. We'll get back to the race in a moment, but given my poor score this weekend, I'm slightly pained to say that we now need to catch up with our grid rival teams. It's a great fantasy motorsport game. The race has got its own league where you can take on Scott, myself, and other better players. Still very much open for sign-ups as well, so you can still join in.
How have you done poorly, given the plan you talked about last week was to get Daniel Ricciardo?
Yeah, it was a great plan. Talked about it with our special guest Michael Laminato for extra Australian insight. All made sense. Ricciardo finished 6th, so good on paper. I was about to commit to it to take the place left by Valtteri Bottas, but for a minor accountancy error to be detected. To be specific, I didn't have enough cash for him, so I had to sign someone cheap and ended up with Yuki Tsunoda as the least worst option, who didn't do brilliantly, but he did get me a few points. I did decide to double down and make him my talent driver, so I doubled his points, but it didn't go especially well. Everything sort of went wrong, really. I had Max Verstappen, obviously, didn't do very well, so just one of those weeks.
This is the point of the podcast where I reach peak smugness then, because I did sign Daniel Ricciardo only on a one-race contract. I just fancied him to do something special at home, and I was rewarded handsomely for my correct and quality accountancy skills. Unfortunately, other transfers for me didn't go quite as well, because I'd made a bit of a blunder early on with the length of contracts that I signed a few drivers on, so I had to do a bit of a rejig. I lost Leclerc, I had Hamilton, and I just thought, right, I'm going to get rid of Hamilton for Verstappen, and then to offset Leclerc, I'm going to trade Red Bull for Ferrari. Now, because of the Verstappen retirement, losing Red Bull's probably not a bad thing, but obviously Verstappen didn't do me much good. I lost some points on Ferrari because of Sainz, but I'd also brought in Fernando Alonso for this race. So at one point on Saturday, I'm sitting there thinking, this is going to work out absolutely brilliantly for me. And I think after Fernando Alonso and the Alpine F1 team, I was probably the saddest person. Oh, and Andrew Benson of the BBC. I was probably the saddest person in the world watching Fernando Alonso crash in qualifying and then have a miserably unlucky Grand Prix.
Yeah, it was a good pick, but just didn't pay off. But yeah, it was terrible. I had Verstappen, Mick Schumacher obviously didn't get in the points. I had George Russell third, was okay. Kevin Magnussen didn't have a great race. Did get quite a few overtaking points. Tsunoda obviously didn't do brilliantly. I had Ferrari, but yeah, not very good. 804. I even swapped around the 4 and the 0 in my mind. So not a good week for me. I was trying to stop you saying how many points you got. How many did you get?
I got 885, Chief. So, I can give you some tips for Imola if you like.
Yeah, well, I do have a vacancy for Imola. I kept Tsunoda for a second race. He got a 2-race deal because I fancied him to do something good on home soil. I was obviously inspired by his early Q1 crash there last year and think he can do something do something similar given my form. But I'm now 401 points behind the league leader, who for the second week in a row is RB Sachs 2008. It's the second week in a row they've led the league. Very, very strong team there. So well done. And yeah, we can but bid to catch up and continue our battle in mid-table mediocrity. We'll keep following this over the year, so do download the Grid Rival app or visit the website so you can join in. You'll find the link in the episode description for this podcast. All I would say is don't do what I did and pick Yuki Tsunoda. Well, let's come back to the Australian Grand Prix, Mark. Mercedes is second in the Constructors' Championship, so things can't be all that bad, can they? Why, though, didn't we see a plethora of updates this weekend? It's trying to combat those porpoising problems and catch up, but it had nothing, basically.
No, and the wing that was going to be a low downforce wing to help with the porpoising didn't appear either. Yeah, they do not give the impression that they're onto the problem and are working towards it and know, when the light will suddenly be switched on. They still seem to be trying to get to the bottom of understanding the problem, and they're using all the same methodologies that has brought them 8 world championships, and so they're very confident that will, unleash the potential of this car. But in terms of how many races may have passed by the time that happens, if it happens, it's looking a bit, as if they're. You'd be hard-pressed to say they're going to be championship contenders when they're 3 races in and still no further towards understanding where they're a second a lap off the pace. And it is that's about where they're at. They're about a second a lap off Ferrari pace. So it's one thing saying, yes, but we know where 7/10 of that is, and then there's just a little bit of refining to do on that. And when we get this and that, they're not at that stage yet. They're still at the stage of trying to understand why this car is so afflicted. And given the quick-fire nature of the races, the compressed calendar, it puts a very difficult spin on their championship aspirations.
Yeah, George Russell said after the race, just expect incremental changes in the coming races. So, there's no promise of a big change. There's probably not a great deal we should say about their race, actually. George Russell did finish third ahead of Lewis Hamilton in fourth, but that was a swap around facilitated by the timing of the safety car for Sebastian Vettel's crash. Hamilton came in first, pitted under green flag conditions. Russell came in under the safety car and actually briefly was ahead of Sergio Perez, but just was never able to stay there despite his best efforts. But a question from the Race Members Club, Scott, from Simon T, connected to what Mark's already talked about, but it'd be great to get your opinion, saying, are there any indications from Mercedes whether they understand the issues they're having and going to spring a big European update, or are they truly stabbing in the dark at the moment to understand the issue? Simon also suggests we should refer to this as Lewis Hamilton Sympathy Corner. What do you think of that, Scott?
I like the suggestion. I think it's I reckon it needs another race or two of a little bit of misery. Obviously, Saudi was really, really bad for Lewis as a weekend. This was better in terms of qualifying and the Grand Prix itself. Lewis did a really good job. Great start. Drove well. Fought Perez really hard. Was looking pretty good. But he lost the place to Perez seconds before the race went under a caution, which was really unfortunate. And then that same caution period coincided with Russell's pit stop, so it allowed Russell to jump them, which just meant Hamilton went from being in a position where he could have been in control of third, probably wouldn't have been able to keep Perez behind him, but could have had a go, to then just being fifth and then just waiting for things to go his way again. He was much better, so I don't think he did anything wrong this weekend. As for Mercedes, Hamilton had said earlier in the weekend that nothing that they do improves the car. because at the moment, ultimately, they just have that same ultimate underlying limitation. And like Mark said, they don't look like a team that's got a really good grasp of it, and we're not going to see a massive load of upgrades, because why throw new parts at a car that you know where the limitation is? You can't stop it. Like you put a new front wing on it, or some flow conditioners around the place or whatever, it's not going to stop the thing from porpoising. So there's no point in doing any of the other stuff. I'd be surprised if we see much in the way of significant car refinements at all until we see them try a new floor or something as dramatic as that.
Yeah, and they did make the point, George Russell in fact said this, that they can't just throw things at the car trial and error style, because there are cost cap implications. I think probably, although anyone hoping Mercedes will get into championship contention will be disappointed they're not throwing things at the car, it does also reflect that at least the mindset is probably right, because they're not just going to do it for the sake of it. But yeah, it's going to be a tough one for them to resolve. Mark, a question from Adam Olsen, who says, why do the Mercedes team seem to be struggling when it seems most of the changes with the new rules are aero and not powertrains? This is about the customer teams as well. Why such a step back when their power units were so dominant before? Was there an engine change that we don't know about? And do we think the power unit weakness that was hinted at is a big problem?
Power unit, by general agreement among the power unit people about where everyone stacks up, power unit deficit of the Mercedes just on performance of the engine itself seems to be about 1/10.5, but they're a second off the pace. Now the 4 Mercedes powered cars are all having various degrees of struggle. But the 2 with the Mercedes gearbox, the 2 customer cars with the Mercedes gearbox, Aston Martin and Williams, are the 2 that are suffering with very similar porpoising problems to Mercedes. And I think there may be some clue in that, just in terms of where the mechanical packaging is and where the center of gravity heights are and where that imposes the stall point and where that is relative to the wheelbase. I think we probably need to start looking, or we'll have to incorporate that in their search for trying to understand what it is, because it does seem to be a little bit too much of a coincidence that those 3 teams are all struggling with the exact same problem. And it's not the power unit. It's 15% at the most is the power unit. The rest is something else. So I think it may be something like that. It may, but it will probably go a long way into the season before we find that. But just logically, it seems just too much of a coincidence that there must be something in common, which is amplifying the problem.
Well, let's stick with Mercedes customer teams. Scott, Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo were 5th and 6th. Lando Norris even started on the second row. So why the turnaround? And can we say now that McLaren is back, or is the note of caution that Mark sounded earlier on in this podcast justified?
Yeah, I think it's way too premature to say that McLaren's back. It's still ultimately further off than it wanted to be this season. If you ask Daniel Ricciardo, you'd probably get a slightly more glass half full answer than you would if you asked the glass half empty Lando Norris, who is just a little bit more realistic, I think. It's just, he even joked on Saturday that he's not quite as optimistic as Daniel is. They put the step this weekend, which was a very, very big step, down to 3 factors. The first one, the absolute biggest one, the one that Norris said or reckoned was about 80% responsible for the performance, was simply the track layout. The car does not like slow speed corners. There was a big step from Bahrain there was a step from Bahrain to Jeddah, switching from a track with a lot more slow corners to a faster, more flowing layout, which Melbourne now is even more so with the track changes. So this track layout just really seemed to suit the McLaren. Not so many really big hard braking points and really low minimum speed corners. So I think that really helped them. Then there were a couple of other sort of smaller factors that played into it. One is that in general, they're just getting the car into a better and better working window as they understand it. They were playing catch up a little bit compared to the other teams after testing, where they had such limited running in the second test in Bahrain. They didn't do as much setup work as they would have liked because they had these brake temperature management problems. That completely compromised their first race weekend in Bahrain, but they were still paying for it a little bit in Saudi, and now they've had before Australia, they had 2 race weekends worth of data to go over, a bit of time to digest it and work out what to do, and they came out from FP1, both drivers were happier with the car, so I think that's helped. And then the final thing is that they did have a small update on the car this weekend, some flow conditioners on the rear corner. So there's a little bit of improving the car there. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to make the car a proper front of the midfield force again. If they want this kind of performance at more tracks, then absolutely the car's going to need far greater updates than we've seen so far.
Let's talk Alpine, Mark. Esteban Ocon finished 7th. Could have been a lot more there, though, given Fernando Alonso's pace. Unfortunately, only managed to turn that into last place after a late second stop, after his points hopes had evaporated. But what was the Alonso-Alpine combination really capable of this weekend, and why didn't it work out?
Alonso Alpine was absolutely on Mercedes' pace. He could have been, with the smooth running of his weekend, he could have been racing Hamilton and Russell. I'm absolutely sure of that. And there's nothing in the numbers that suggest it had any performance deficit to the Mercs. It is very quick down the straight. It's just inherently it's quite aero efficient. It's not great on slow corners. It's okay on slow corners. It's not. It's better around sector 3 than a McLaren, for example. But it's not in the league of a Ferrari or anything like that. But the new track layout, the Melbourne track layout, I'm sure did it a big favour, extended the straights. But the lap still had to be driven, and Fernando was absolutely on fire during qualifying. He'd really got it by the scruff of the neck, and it's a sort of circuit that he brings out his best anyway. And it was just it all went wrong with a little £1.50 rubber O-ring that split and seal in the hydraulic system at exactly the wrong moment, and that defined his weekend.
Yeah, well, Alonso could have been probably 4th on the grid, couldn't he? Which would have been a very different state of affairs going into the race. But it was a bit weird, the race, wasn't it? Because he stayed out on hards and stayed out under the safety car, but then didn't do what Albon did and carry on all the way to end. It seemed they ended up getting a little bit caught between 2 stalls.
Yeah, and I think he just wanted to have a crack at the fastest lap just for the hell of it because they weren't running in the points at that time. And I think the lure of a possible lower points finish was probably less than that of attacking for the fastest lap. Not that he would have got a point for it because he was out of the top 10, but just for the pride of it.
Yeah, just one of those weekends. Scott, Alfa Romeo had a solid weekend. Valtteri Bottas was 8th. Wasn't quite up to their previous standards, but still pretty good. Bottas is having a lovely time at Alfa Romeo, though, isn't it? Even though that run of Q3 appearances, which stretched back to the start of 2017, ended.
Yep, it's lovely to pay a trip to Valtteri Bottas congratulatory corner. He's driving very well. There were a couple of little mistakes. This race, he wasn't. I don't think he was quite on top of it this weekend, but that's because the car wasn't quite the force it's been in the first couple of weekends. So he was probably chasing things a little bit. When I spoke to him after qualifying, he said that it was disappointing to have missed out on Q3, but in itself was a good sign because it shows the standard that they've set now for this season. The target has to be Q3 in points every race. That's what they want. They did a good job in the Grand Prix to turn that into a lower points finish in the end. But you're right, Bottas is just a lot happier there. I had a long chat with him on Thursday actually ahead of the weekend starting. There'll be a piece on the race between now and Imola, looking at that, at the sort of greater authority that he feels he has within Alfa compared to Mercedes, the the way he feels he's able to influence things, what he's learning about the team, what he's liking about the Ferrari power unit. He's just, and also little things like why he's embracing that mentorship role with Zhou Guanyu. Like he really likes that kind of side of it as well. So yeah, I just feel like this is a situation that's bringing the best out of Bottas on track and off it, and he's absolutely what Alfa Romeo needs now. I think a few people uncharitably, maybe I was sort of a bit guilty of falling into this camp a little bit as well. Thought that Bottas would be sort of like a slightly more like a glorified Kimi Räikkönen, in that it wasn't really offering out for Romeo all that much in terms of a proper benchmark. But I think that's been proven to be wrong. He's sort of blending the best of the drivers that Alfa had last year and then some. He's got that qualifying prowess that Antonio Giovinazzi has, but he has it every Saturday rather than once every 3 or 4 Grand Prix. And he's got Raikkonen's ability to just be there at the end, bagging points if the car's good enough to score points. So he's absolutely what Alfa Romeo needs.
Let's talk about Pierre Gasly quickly. He picked up 9th place in the AlphaTauri. Seems about right for that car. Generally, he's about 8th or 9th with a reasonable race. Had a pretty unfortunate Q2, which included Yuki Tsunoda, his teammate, going off in front of him at turn 11 and ruining one of his laps. It's all sort of okay there, isn't it? But a weekend like this would have been sort of 4th, 5th, 6th last year, whereas now it's kind of 8th or 9th. He would have been 8th if he hadn't had that brief off ahead of Bottas.
Yeah, it has dropped a chunk since last year, I think. It's just how the new regulations have reshuffled the pack and where they've the job that they've done on the new regulations. It's just sort of dropped them off a little bit further from what they were. I think last year on average they were within on a qualifying average they were within about 0.6 of the Red Bull, whereas this year they're over a second adrift. So it's just not yet quite as good a car. Whether it has that performance within it to be developed to the level of last year's car, who knows? But at the moment, that's just a sort of a par for the course weekend for them, really, as you say.
Yeah, and Yuki Tsunoda, not quite at Gasly's level again, had another difficult race. Let's move on to Williams. Alex Albon scored their first point this year with a very well-executed drive. Marathon stint on hards, having started at the back. He made a stop at the end of the penultimate lap and emerged just in front of Zhou, so took 10th place. And we had a question from Henri Heiler about this, who says that Williams' pit box was before the timing line, so could Albon have just waited until the last moment, pitted and crossed the line in the pits after changing tyres, echoing Schumacher at Silverstone in 98, or does it only count as a pit stop if you exit the pits entirely? I can answer that one. Yeah, you do have to exit the pits. The rules say that unless you use intermediates or wets, you have to use 2 compounds of dry tyre. And the definition of use is you have to cross the timing line at the pit exit, and you have to do that during the race. So had Albon stopped on the last lap, firstly, he'd have been disqualified anyway. And actually, if you look at the timing, all it would have done is given him 1 place anyway. I think he'd have beaten Gasly instead of being behind him. But you have to say, Mark, well-executed drive from Albon, wasn't it?
It was a lovely drive from last on the grid, penalised last on the grid. And it's difficult to say because he did that virtually, essentially the whole race on the hard tyre. And I think the hard tyre, once he got it up to temperature, was probably a better tyre. So it was maybe flattering the car, but he was doing some pretty good times there very late in the race. And so either it's just a flattering picture from a tyre that was hardly anybody else used, which was actually very good, or they're making some sort of progress there. We'll get to find out coming races, I guess.
Yeah, they feel like they're getting there slowly. Albon seems relatively happy with the car. In fact, even since Bahrain qualifying, he's been quite happy with the feel of the car. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. And the fact that Albon just pipped Guan Yu Zhou tells you he probably did do a pretty decent drive, because that could easily have been 11th or 12th place had he given away a little bit of time elsewhere in the race. We should say Zhou seems to be very much making 11th place his own this season. He was 11th in Saudi Arabia. He was 11th until the last lap in Bahrain when he picked up 10th when Perez had his problems. So the most frustrating of all positions for him. Scott, also on the subject of Williams, Rupert Stevens asked if we had any specific clues as to why the Williams is so far off the pace.
Well, it's obviously a more limited car. It does have a couple of specific limitations. One is a pretty boring and standard answer, which I just think it just has less downforce than any other car on the grid. Although it doesn't look as bad as the Aston Martin, but I think the Aston Martin is running in a very compromised state to deal with its own porpoising problem. So that's a slightly different or difficult point of comparison. But the other limitation is definitely the under braking. The Williams doesn't look particularly confident on the brakes, and it has sometimes has a slightly difficult through corner balance as well. And this is just exacerbated in slow corners, obviously. So Bahrain was kind of the worst case scenario for Williams. They always felt like it wouldn't really be as bad as it was in Bahrain after the fact. After that, sorry. And to be fair, Albon wasn't a million miles off the pace in qualifying. He very nearly made it into Q2. Not that it would have mattered, because he obviously his car failed to provide the necessary fuel sample, which is why he got that disqualification. But it just looks like when there are tracks that don't sort of hit on the Williams' main limitations at the moment, it's just a marginal Q1, Q2 car, which is sort of fine, really. I mean, it's not what the team really wanted, but they're not detached like they look like they might be for the season in Bahrain. It does look like that level of misery was track specific, and then the rest of the time they're going to be sort of part of that lower midfield group. Mainly, I feel like at the moment though, their main rival is just going to be Aston Martin, but then they'll just be trying to pick off some other cars when they have poor weekends, like for example Haas having a bit of an off one this weekend, having been one of the underdog stars of 2022 up till now.
And let's quickly talk, Scott, about Aston Martin. They headed into the weekend with a boost. Sebastian Vettel was back after his recovery from COVID-19. Couldn't have gone much worse, really, could it? By my reckoning, 4 crashes and engine change for that team. Kind of in keeping with the team's season, though.
Yeah, it's an absolute disaster. They are low on spares now because of the amount of crashes that they've had. I would imagine there's plenty of tired people in that team. To be like, fair play to them for getting, in the end, both cars out in qualifying. Getting Vettel out for one futile lap at the end of Q1 was only possible because Lance Stroll had triggered the late red flag by causing that crash with Latifi at the end of Q1, which I'm adamant Stroll was. I completely agree with the stewards predominantly to blame for it. It was a silly accident, especially after the team had worked so hard to get his car out for qualifying. But there was also the fact that Vettel, when he was driving the car, wasn't driving it very well. He had the engine failure in FP1, didn't do any running in FP2, crashed in FP3, crashed in. Got out in qualifying, had an off early in the Grand Prix, then crashed in the Grand Prix. So he just didn't look. He was adamant that he didn't have any after effects from COVID or anything like that. He felt fine in himself, but I just think it was a combination of maybe being just not quite in the groove because of the lack of running in not in the last few weeks. I don't really feel like that played a part. It was just this weekend he didn't really get into a rhythm, and also just is a difficult car to drive. So when you're just not feeling it, you're just not feeling it. And this weekend, I think car and driver had plenty of limitations about them.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it. And again, Aston Martin, it's going to take a while for them to solve their problems, but they do have changes in the pipeline. But exactly when we'll see them, who knows? Mark, Haas, Mick Schumacher was 13th, Kevin Magnussen 14th. So what exactly has happened to them?
Yeah, their form does seem a bit volatile, doesn't it? I don't know how much of it's a hangover from the tough weekend that they had with the building up the new car after Mick Schumacher's crash in Jeddah. It seems better at low speed sections than flat out running, but Magnussen was okay in Jeddah, so that's not the full explanation. And you don't need to lose much time in that group to go from the front of it to the back of it. And I think that's what we've seen. I would be very surprised if it doesn't bounce back quite hard at Imola, because I think that's the sort of layout which should suit its traits. But I think a little bit of underperformance from the team maybe in finding the right setup, and a little bit just not a perfect track layout for it.
Yeah, Kevin Magnussen said after qualifying that he felt the starting setup for the weekend wasn't really right, and there was a suggestion maybe they were slightly caught out by the changing track surface in Australia. Obviously, they've gone very well there in the past, Haas, in terms of pace. Sometimes not got the results they deserved, but it just seemed to be a little bit all at sea. And Magnussen was ill as well on Friday, which probably didn't help his preparation, but chances are it'll just be a one-off and they'll be back in points contention next week. Well, thanks very much, Scott Mitchell and Mark Hughes, for your insight. Head to therace.com and don't forget the hyphen, as there's loads to read there. Mark Hughes' race analysis will be up. Do check out our sister podcasts, including the Race IndyCar podcast and MotoGP, as both of them are racing this weekend, of course. And also, if video's your thing, check out our YouTube channel. F1's turning its attention to Imola now, but that's still 2 weeks away. But in the meantime, stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of F1.